What's up, investors? It's the Russian dude. Here's the part of this war that Russian propaganda really does not want ordinary people to understand. Every burning oil terminal, every damaged village, every displaced family, every missing housing certificate and every broken promise from Moscow has a price tag. And now that price tag is landing directly on Russian citizens themselves. Ukraine has recently launched drone strikes at oil loading terminals across Russian port cities, as we all know, such as for example Ust-Luga and Primorsk, and the fire at Ust-Luga specifically was reportedly even visible from Estonia and captured by satellite images. But the Kremlin's real problem is not only reduced oil loading capacity or lower export revenue, even though this hurts a lot as well. The real problem is that port infrastructure costs serious money to repair, and Russia's budget is already being squeezed by the massive level of war spending. And this is where the Kursk region becomes so important, because it shows what happens when war damage is no longer just something Russia creates somewhere else, but something Russia must now pay on for its own territory. The Ukrainian army entered the Kursk region, as we guys remember, August 6, 2024, and even at the height of that fighting, the area under Ukrainian control was only mere 5% of the entire region, including several dozen villages and the town of Sudzha, home to approximately only 5,000 people. In other words, this was a very small piece of territory in a country of 146 million people, the biggest country in the world, and yet official estimates put the infrastructure damage in Kursk at 700 billion rubles, not including the cost of combat operations, equipment losses, or the broader human economic consequences, which means that the real total moves towards something closer, much like 1 trillion rubles or even more. So today, let's talk about what the Kursk refugee crisis reveals about the real cost of Putin's war, why 112,620 displaced residents are still fighting for basic compensation, why the government cut the 65,000 ruble monthly payments it had promised, why housing certificates have turned into a bureaucratic trap, and finally, why the fantasy of Russia rebuilding Donbass collapses the moment you look at what is happening right now inside Russia itself. Let's talk about all of this one by one in today's video. Now here is where most people go wrong, because when they hear about the Ukrainian operation in the Kursk region, they either imagine some massive invasion of Russia or dismiss it as some minor border episode. But the real point is not the size of the territory, the real point is the size of the bill. And at its peak, the Ukrainian-controlled area was once again approximately 5% of the entire Kursk region. We're not talking about Moscow, St. Petersburg, Kazan, or just another huge industrial hub. No, we are talking about a very limited border area, several dozen villages only, and Sudzha, one of Russia's least populated municipalities with approximately 5,000 only residents. But even this limited, very small area produced an official damage estimated of 700 billion rubles. Covering destroyed facilities and residential property, while also excluding the cost of the fighting itself, the lost equipment, and the long-term consequences of turning part of a Russian region into a dangerous, inaccessible zone. That is the first uncomfortable lesson for the Kremlin. War becomes expensive when roads need repairs, houses become unlivable, residents cannot return, bridges need rebuilding, schools stop functioning, and the government suddenly has to transform patriotic speeches into an actual construction contracts. And this is exactly where propaganda runs into reality, because Russian television can spend years saying that the country is too large and too powerful to be financially hurt. But Kursk shows that even a relatively limited disaster creates a bill that the state does not want to pay quickly, honestly, or even fully. This is also why the Donbass reconstruction fantasy becomes much even harder to believe. If the Kremlin, struggles to compensate people from one damaged border region inside Russia, then, how exactly is it supposed to rebuild dozens of devastated towns and cities across occupied Ukrainian territory, with no guarantees that they're even gonna keep it? Where the damage is measured not already in hundreds of billions, but already in trillions of rubles, if not more. Kursk is not just a local crisis, it is a preview of the bigger war bill. And once you understand that, the next question becomes just extremely simple. What happens to the people who lost their homes and were promised help? By the way, have you ever noticed how the very same political event can feel either like a victory or a confrontation, just literally depending on single headline? Just look at this story. One version says Ukraine applauds the Baltic's refusal to allow Fico to use its airspace to travel to Moscow. That framing feels clear, almost celebratory, like this is some kind of a unified move supporting Ukraine and pushing back against Russia. But then you see another headline. Robert Fico struggle over the Victory Day parade. Baltic Republic refuses Slovak head of government overflight to Moscow. Now it feels completely different, right? Suddenly it's not about support, it's just about conflict between European states, something stirring inside the European Union, a struggle, political tension, even internal division. Same decision, same event, just two totally different emotional signals. This is exactly why I personally use ground news. Instead of getting just one version pushed to you, you can compare headlines side by side and instantly see how language shifts, from applause to struggle, from unity to division, and how that obviously shapes your understanding in the end. Ground news also shows you who is covering the story, bias distribution, 56% leaning left, for example, in our case, and where those outlets sit across the political spectrum. So you can see whether coverage leans towards geopolitical alignment or, I don't know, like in our case, internal European tension. Then the AI even summarizes articles for you and shows the bias comparison, what left focuses on and what right focuses on, so that you will see exactly how the media wants to influence your perception. That is the difference between just reacting to a headline and actually understanding what is going on. So guys, if you want 40% off the Vantage plan, please scan this QR code or go to ground.news/RussianDude, and once again please subscribe. See the way same articles are presented and then decide for yourself what it actually means. Thanks so much Ground News for sponsoring this video. Now back to the program. Thanks so much for watching these promos, it helps our channel a lot. So yes, back to Kursk. The official number of displaced residents from the affected parts of the Kursk region is 112,620 people. And even if the real figure is higher, the official number alone already shows how quickly the Russian state can move from emotional promises to cold budget limits. Between March 2025 and January 26, displaced residents received 65,000 rubles per person per month, which was supposed to cover rent and just very basic living expenses while people waited for housing certificates or another long-term solution. For a couple that meant 130,000 rubles per month, for a family of 3, 195,000 rubles, for a family of 4, 260,000 rubles per month. And yes, for some families this could support a decent temporary life when they waited, but the key word is once again temporary, because these people did not simply need monthly rent support, they needed permanent housing, replacement property, legal certainty, and a real path back to normal life. Both Vladimir Putin and Kursk governor Alexander Hinstein gave the impression that these 65,000 ruble payments would continue for as long as affected residents needed financial assistance. But, well, as you guessed it, as everything happens in the Kremlin, the official paperwork said something different. It tied the payments to the duration of the counter-terrorism operation or CTO in Kursk. Then, in January 2026, the payments were discontinued. Even though many people were still displaced, the CTO was still in effect, and housing certificates could take years. Officials said that the funds were relocated for other needs, which is just a very polite bureaucratic phrase for leaving people to survive on their own while the state moves the money somewhere else. Well, we are not the Kremlin, so we'll just say it. Money went to the war. And probably pockets of the oligarchs. As a result, people unfortunately lost homes, property, neighborhoods, routines, documents, belongings, just basic stability. The government gave them temporary support, used that support as proof that it was handling the crisis, and then just cut the program before solving the actual housing problem. When displaced residents began protesting, the authorities did not respond with a clear compensation schedule, a transparent housing plan, or maybe even a serious public accountability, at least maybe, and a sorry from the local authorities, nothing. Instead, local United Russia officials and regional media started building the image of the greedy refugee. Literal quote, someone who supposedly received enough money and still had the nerve to complain while the rest of the country is fighting the war. Special military operation. Just the classic Kremlin trick. When the state owes people money, it tells everyone else that those people are spoiled. And once the payments fully disappeared, the next stage became even uglier, because the propaganda machine began turning other local residents against those displaced families. Let's talk about it right now. Here's the part that shocked me the most. Local television reportedly tried to present Kursk refugees as if they were quietly becoming rich from these compensation payments, with one broadcaster even claiming that a family of 4 had received 3.6 million rubles over 10 months. Except that, well, if you do basic math, it, doesn't add up. A family of 4 receiving 260,000 rubles per month for 10 months would receive 2.6 millions, not 3.6 million. Simple as that. And even if such a family somehow saved 1 or 2 million rubles, that still would not buy them a replacement home, restore their property, or rebuild the life they had before the settlement became unsafe or inaccessible. And of course, not every displaced household is a family of 4. Some are single people, some are couples, some families of 3, some even have older relatives or children living with them under the same roof. Many simply cannot save anything because rent, food, transportation, medicine and basic replacement items eat through this money very quickly when you have lost almost everything. But, well, as you expected, propaganda does not want the average reality. It wants the biggest possible number, somebody to point figure at, something to complain about, stripped of context, repeated loudly enough so people stop asking why the state broke its promise and start asking why these refugees are still complaining. Sadly, this tactic worked on some Kursk residents who were not directly affected by the incursion. Instead of asking why the war reached Russian territory, why 112,620 people were displaced, or why the government could not quickly issue housing certificates, people were encouraged to resent displaced families themselves. That is how the authorities protect themselves politically. They turn state failure into social conflict, they turn broken promises into envy, and they turn victims into targets. And when displaced residents gathered again in central Kursk in March, outside the regional administration building, officials did not even come out to properly engage with them, as pretty much everything similar happens across entire Russia. No, instead, police arrived at the scene, and even though no arrests were made, but protesters were warned that further rallies like this would be considered unacceptable. The state failed to protect their homes, failed to keep monthly support in place, failed to issue certificates at a serious pace, and then still found energy to warn them not to protest too loudly. That is the relationship between the Russian state and ordinary people in one picture. You can suffer quietly, you can wait patiently, you can believe promises, but the moment you ask for the compensation, officials themselves promised, by the way, suddenly you become the problem. And that brings us to the housing certificate system, because this is where the bureaucratic maze becomes almost absurd. This is the major topic of today's video, so let's focus on this right now. Now here is where things get really ugly, because the housing certificate system sounds like the practical solution to the Kursk crisis, but in reality it has become a maze where every single door leads to another excuse. One trick is the loose interpretation of what counts as a combat zone. Your village may have been badly damaged, but officials can still argue that it was not officially part of this combat zone, which pushes residents into a legal gray area where everyone knows that what happened, but the paperwork pretends nothing happened, not to see it at all. Another trick is the language around property damage. Was the home just damaged, destroyed, completely destroyed, obliterated, I don't know. For a family that cannot live there anymore, this sounds insane, because people do not need a vocabulary lesson. They need just housing, a roof over their heads. But the biggest problem is the inspection requirement. To receive this housing certificate, a task force is supposed to visit the site and assess the property. But many sites, first of all, are considered dangerous, mined, exposed to drones, or inaccessible completely. So the task force cannot inspect the home, and because the task force cannot inspect the home, people cannot, guessed it, receive the certificate. And even if they do the inspection, guess what? They work for the Kremlin. So people's interests are not in their biggest priority, if any priority at all. In other words, the state says, we cannot compensate you because we cannot confirm the damage. And we cannot confirm the damage because the area is too dangerous. And the area is too dangerous because of the war that created the damage. And who started the war? Well, it's the Ukrainians, of course, not us. That's not a solution, that's a bureaucratic trap. Victoria Penkova, an aide to the Kursk governor, reportedly told former residents of the Glushkova district that a temporary shelter was a decent solution, her exact quote. As if people who lost their homes should be grateful for just being placed somewhere temporary, in literal tents, while waiting indefinitely for the government to decide what their lives are worth. And then, in December 2025, the same official reportedly told residents that it was their fault they had failed to protect their homes from Ukrainian troops. Which perfectly captures the cruelty of this system. The state starts the war, the consequences reach civilians, and then officials suggest civilians should have defended their own houses. Voila! There is supposedly another way to assess damage. The defense ministry can use potentially aerial photography, but according to the authorities, service members refuse to do it because of the risk of being detected, exposed, and struck by the Ukrainian army. And this is where the logic, once again, collapses. Because Russia constantly advertises drone-related military roles by saying operators can work from dozens of kilometers away, the safest positions possible. But when displaced residents need this drone-exact footage to document damaged homes, simply not even attack someone, well, suddenly the mission becomes too dangerous to do. Penkova reportedly said that a certificate is not worth a service member's life, another quote from her. But residents are not asking anyone to walk into danger with a clipboard. They're asking the state to use the technology it constantly brags about to document the damage and just issue compensation. And then there is even a deeper question. If civilians cannot return to these areas, if some places have been inaccessible for more than a year, if normal life cannot resume, then why does the exact level of physical damage matter so much? Even a house that technically survived is useless if the family cannot safely live in it. The obvious solution would be to issue certificates broadly to affected residents and solve the problems at scale. The government once talked about issuing 200 certificates per day. Remember this number, very important, 200 per day. And even at that pace, it would take more than 18 months to rehouse everyone. But according to local reporting, only 97 certificates were issued in the entire month of January 2026. And then in March, allocated funds were expected to cover about 100 certificates, the whole month. At that speed, some displaced residents may wait for years and possibly decades before receiving what they were promised. In February, Russia's Human Rights Commissioner Tatyana Moskalkova raised another issue. Under certain current rules, a person who lost 2 homes gets only 1 compensated. She suggested restoring all lost property though, even if with delays. And she's, right, but well, the bigger problem is that many people are still waiting for even at least 1 home compensation. So when officials talk about certificates, many Kursk refugees do not hear a solution, they only hear another delay. And while people are stuck in this system, the government is changing local power in a way that makes it even harder for them to be heard. Let's talk about it now, final chapter. This is a detail that most people miss. While displaced people in Kursk are waiting for compensation, the region is also implementing a consolidation policy that will merge 347 municipalities into 33 districts. That may sound like boring administrative reform, but, well, it matters. Small local assemblies are often the only accessible level of government for residents. In smaller settlements, local officials may know families personally, understand which villages were damaged, know who were evacuated, and know which roads, houses, and public buildings are affected. But when 347 municipalities are merged only into 33 districts, almost 10 to 1, decision-making obviously moves upward. Officials become more distant, and residents lose these direct pressure points, these connections. At the exact moment displaced people need more local representation, the system is becoming more centralized. And that fits just perfectly the Kremlin's broader model, absolutely identically, as always. The Russian state does not want a responsive government. It wants vertical control. It wants authority moving downward and complaints being filtered upward until they disappear into paperwork, committees, and budget excuses. This is why this Kursk situation is just absolutely so revealing. The same state that claims it can confront the entire West, rebuild occupied territories of half of another country, sustain years of military spending, and then restore everything to war damages, is now struggling to properly support 112,620 displaced people inside Russia itself, of their own citizens. And now, connect all this back to Ust-Luga and Primorsk. Every damaged oil terminal means pressure on export capacity, pressure on revenue, pressure on infrastructure budgets, and pressure on a system already choosing between military spending, regional repairs, propaganda, social support, and compensation for displaced citizens. Ust-Luga's oil terminal reportedly burned for several days once again, and while experts still need to assess the full impact on Russia's oil exports, port infrastructure is expensive, technical, and strategically important, something that needs to be taken care of right now. It cannot be restored with slogans or propaganda. This is the part that, once again, propaganda avoids, because it loves talking about sacrifice, history, and destiny, but it hates talking about invoices. And this is where the comparison with Donbass becomes completely unavoidable. The Kremlin has claimed it can rebuild what it destroyed. It even tried to turn Mariupol into a showcase city. Around 250,000 residents, roughly half of Mariupol's population, stayed behind as a result. New residential neighborhoods were built, at least for first couple of months of the invasion. Some people received apartments, and Vladimir Putin even visited Mariupol because the city mattered for the Kremlin's public image. But then, later, the reconstruction story completely slowed down until it probably even ceased to exist entirely. Compensation housing funds ran out mysteriously. Some new real estate projects shifted towards mortgage plan residences. People whose homes survived were reportedly pushed out in some cases. The shiny showcase started looking much less convincing. So if Russia cannot quickly and fairly rehouse displaced residents in Kursk, how is it then supposed to rebuild dozens of heavily damaged cities and towns across the entire Donbass region? If 700 billion rubles in Kursk damage already creates this level of delay, resentment, and bureaucratic evasion, what happens when the bill is measured in trillions? Tens, if not hundreds of trillions. That is why Kursk is not just a side story, it is yet another crack in the whole narrative. Guys, if this video essay makes sense to you and you want to hear more in the future, please make sure to subscribe to our channel, like this video. Thanks so much Ground News for sponsoring this video. Please scan the QR code and use the links down below. Thanks so much for watching. See you on Monday.
We won't succumb to their tricks, the facade they try to sell. Their twisted words and feeble claims on us all they cannot quell. We see through their lies, their feeble attempts to sway. We do not believe in